Hello and welcome back to the Pew, everybody. My name is John Edwards. I'm your host, and I am so excited to invite you back into another one of these bonus episodes of Just a Guy in the Pew. If you've been following what we've been doing lately, you know that we've had on some of our favorite Catholic presenters and guests in the church. And today is no different. Today we're going to have a priest on that has been a tremendous gift to the church. It's been a gift in my life and probably some of yours. But today we're going to have on Father Timothy Gallagher. And before I bring him up, I want to tell you a little bit about him. So first of all, Father Timothy Gallagher was ordained in 1979 as a member of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, a religious community dedicated to retreats and spiritual formation according to the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius. Having obtained his doctorate in 1983 from the Gregorian University, he has taught at St. John Seminary in Massachusetts and also Our Lady of Grace Seminary in Boston. He's assisted in formation work and served 2 terms as provincial in his own community. He has dedicated many years to an extensive international ministry of retreats, spiritual direction, and teaching about the spiritual life. He's a frequent speaker on EWTN, and his digitally recorded talks are utilized internationally. He's written 8 books on Ignatian spirituality and discernment of spirits and prayer, and currently holds the St. Ignatius Chair for Spiritual Formation at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up my friend Father Timothy Gallagher. Father Gallagher, thank you for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Oh, it's great to be with you, John. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Yes, sir. Well, I've been excited about this for a while. I know we were going to do this back in March, and you had a lot going on. And gosh, with the pandemic and everything in the world now, everybody's got a lot of things being shifted around. So thank you for being available today. And this is an interview that I've been looking forward to for a while because so many of the listeners, so many guys that listen to us, they write in all the time about struggling to make decisions in their life, hearing different voices and thoughts in their head and not knowing where they're coming from, and just struggling to really discern God's voice and call in their life. And so I know several years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to your books and helped me to understand Ignatian spirituality, of course, better than I did at the time. And you've made it very easy for a lot of people through all of your books. So I just want to welcome you, and I want to start off with just asking you personally, who was St. Ignatius and why did you believe he was important?
Well, probably the best way to introduce that is this. I mean, we could go through the biography, 16th century Spaniard, pretty wayward until the age of 30, major conversion, and then dedicated to the Lord, founder of the Jesuits. Great impact on the church, obviously, in wonderful ways. But I'd go back to the moment when he was wounded in battle. He had 3 surgeries on his leg and eventually was well in every way except that he couldn't walk, and asked for reading and was given a kind of reading he'd never done before. There was a volume of the life of Jesus and another with lives of the saints. And he starts reading these things to pass the time and now finds 2 different sets of thoughts arising. One about a very worldly project. It's concretely the pursuit of a woman who socially would be unattainable for him, probably the younger sister of the king. And then he finds himself for the first time thinking about living like the saints that he's reading about, Francis and Dominic, 2 different ways of directing his life. And the pivotal moment comes, and this is where his whole teaching on discernment is born, when it dawns on him that after he spent hours thinking about how he'll pursue the unattainable woman, which is really engaging while he's thinking about it, he always winds up feeling empty, dry, unhappy. Whereas when he's been thinking about living like St. Francis, St. Dominic, and the others, again, very engaging while he's thinking about it, his heart remains happy and content. And that's the pivotal moment in his life. That's where his teaching on discernment is born, when he begins to realize that if you pay attention to what's going on in your heart and in your thoughts, you can discover where God is leading, and you can also discover where God doesn't want you to go. And of course, he makes the decision to imitate the saints with the fruit that we know. But that's when his teaching is born. If you are attentive, if you learn how to be attentive to the experience that's always going on in all of us, in our hearts and thoughts, there is a spiritual read on that will firmly protect us from straying from God, following the what he calls the enemy, the evil one, and then firmly embracing where God is leading in our lives. So that's the key thing.
Yeah, and I think that's something that so many people struggle with. I know I have in my life is Sometimes in prayer, I'm asking questions and asking for directions and asking God to lead in a certain way. And sometimes it's very hard to distinguish a voice at all or to hear something or a direction there. And so I think this is so important in the everyday person's life to learn as a Catholic, because we do need help finding what God wants of us and the things that He doesn't, like you said. When did you, Father, first discover these teachings? And when did you know that teaching this discernment of spirits was what you were called to do?
Well, my first exposure to it was when I made the Ignatian retreat under the guidance of a really wonderful French-Canadian Jesuit. That was just before I was ordained to the diaconate. But the real pivotal moment came when I sort of hesitantly started giving little half-hour talks on Ignatius's 14 rules, practical guidelines for
Mhm.
making sense out of the spiritual experience and knowing how to respond to it. And it was in particular one retreat where we had a small group of retreatants, and over 8 days, I went through these 14 guidelines or rules with them. And it was electric. They knew in the reception of the material, and I knew in the transmission of it, that something really important had happened. Well, that group kept asking for more retreats. I was doing 3 a year for them, and it just kept growing like that. So, of course, I did an awful lot of pretty serious study, to be properly grounded in the material, and that was very enlightening. But what really led to this whole work, which I never planned, you know,
Yeah.
um, I trust the Lord did, but what really led to it was the response of people to this material. No one's ever explained this to me before. Now, for the first time, I understand what's going on. Now I know what that situation was all about. And another time around, I'd know how to respond differently. And it was out of that that I came to see the biblical summary of what Ignatius is doing in these 14 rules as the setting of captives free. That's what Jesus
Mm.
uh, indicates as the essence of his message in Luke 4 in the synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has appointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, to let the oppressed go free. So many of us, John, and we all know it, live with a kind of grayness of discouragement and heaviness, and there are
Yeah.
many reasons for it now, and they've grown in recent years. If you think of the pandemic, the situation in the culture, the uncertainties in our own country, the sufferings of our church, people's individual lives, there's a lot of vulnerability to this kind of heaviness or discouragement. And here is this short, essential clarity with clarity with a clarity that's unparalleled in our Catholic
Mm.
spiritual tradition. Short teaching that you can get a hold of, learn, and put into practice that can do an awful lot with God's grace to turn that around. That's why I love teaching it.
Yeah. And I think you're exciting a lot of people in just what you said, because there are so many struggles right now. I get countless emails and messages, and I feel it in my own life with just the
Yeah,
uncertainty, just in the pandemic itself. Is the world going to ever go back to normal? Right? Is our country ever going to quit being divided? All of these different things that we see out there. And if you're not trained in this the way you're talking about, or at least have some knowledge of the principles, then you can get so caught up in these things and lead you to despair and dryness in your faith and all of these things. And so I don't want to keep people from the next question, because I'm sure they're all wanting to hear this right now. Is you mentioned the 14 steps. So what are those steps? Could you take us through them and sort of give us a rundown of what it is to discern the way that you're talking about?
sure. Now, Ignatius calls them rules. And by that word, what he means is a short, essential statement. It might be one sentence or two, which gives a basic instruction about a spiritual reality, but above all, gives practical tools for responding to it in daily life. Back in the 1980s, when I first started presenting and teaching these rules, people kind of shied away from that word rule.
Yeah.
We're Americans, live free or die, don't tread on me, just do it all the rest of that.
Sure,
But
sure.
that's changed dramatically in recent years because there is such chaos now in the culture that the word rule has become it's seen in a whole different way. Think of Jordan Peterson's mega bestseller with millions of copies and translated into 50 languages, 12 Rules for Life, rules.
Mhm.
If you look up on Amazon, the word just type in rules, you'll get over 70,000 responses to it,
Wow.
in publications. So 500 years ago, Ignatius of Loyola entered into this confused interior experience, the stirrings that ebb and flow in our hearts, anxiety, hope, attraction, resistance, and then the various thoughts that accompany them. I should do this. It's time to stop doing that. Maybe I missed that out. All of these kinds of things, and crafted a clear, usable way to do three things: to become aware of this interior experience, which is always going on. So, if I may reverently ask John, of myself and you and any listening, what was in our hearts and thoughts when we awoke this morning and started the day? Did we even notice? What's been in our hearts and thoughts for the last 6 months, the last year, 2 or 5? So the first thing Ignatius will help us to do is just notice that this is going on. The second thing then is give us tools to work with it until we understand what is of God and what is not of God in this experience. To use his vocabulary, what is of the good spirit and what is of the enemy. And then thirdly, to take the appropriate action, accepting, drinking in, being guided by what we know to be of God in this attraction, this way of thinking, and so forth, and firmly rejecting what we now know to be not of God or of the enemy, so that it can never lead us astray. So that's it. Be aware, understand, take action, accept, and reject. That's what it is. And the 14 rules take you through a number of experiences. You tell me, John. We can exemplify some of them if you'd like,
Sure.
whatever would be most helpful.
Yeah, I would love to hear you do some of that. I know that's one thing I love about your books is it's not just explaining something like that. You give examples, and one of the favorite books that you've written of mine was Discernment of Spirits in Marriage, where you actually applied these rules to marriage, and I found it very helpful in my own marriage. So yeah, I'd love to go through those things and talk about it a little bit if you want to give us some examples.
Okay, let's play out. So let's take a college student, and he's a sophomore. He was raised Catholic, but it wasn't the main thing in his life. And when he got to college, stopped going to church, got involved with a group of guys and promiscuity and some substance abuse and so on, everything that goes along with that. And everything outwardly looking, he seemed to be going well enough. But something in him wasn't really satisfied. This is too little. I don't, not really happy. I won't let other people know it, but it's there when I'm alone and silent. Okay, what you've got going on there is Ignatius' first rule. When a person is living a life far from God, a life of serious sin, then the evil one, that's the world, the flesh, and the devil. So Ignatius calls that the enemy. What the evil one will do is just keep the person's imagination filled with images of sensual pleasures. And think of today with
Yeah.
screens everywhere and in our pockets, because as long as, and it's an effective tactic, as long as our imaginations are filled with such images, we're very likely to pursue that way of life. What the good spirit, that's the Holy Spirit, the good angels, the work of grace in us through baptism, good influences around us in the world, God and all those influences that are from God and directed toward God. What the good spirit will do is exactly the opposite. Ignatius says will sting and bite. That's that sense of
Mm.
uneasiness. Ignatius famously called it restlessness until we rest in God. That sense that
Yeah.
I want more than this. I'm not happy this way. I don't want to keep on going this way. All right, now let's say the sophomore welcomes the action of the good spirit. Maybe gets up his courage and goes and sits in the back pew at a Sunday mass, and doesn't want any of his friends to know, maybe even, but something that he experiences there in the communion of the people, maybe something that's said in the homily that speaks to him. It begins a change in his life, and now he returns to the church, and let's say it's 3 or 4 years later. Now he's back regularly going to Sunday Mass. Let's give him a few more years. Let's put him in his 40s. He's married,
Okay.
has maybe 2 children, 3 children, and now he's faithful to Sunday Mass, confession occasionally through the year, prayer very occasionally. As he has a need here, maybe before meals, something like that. And then this Sunday, the pastor announces that the parish is going to have a weekend retreat in the upcoming Lent. And he's kind of interested in this. He's never done anything like this before. His wife encourages him to do it, and he goes. And he likes it. The times of quiet, the talks speak to his heart. Saturday evening, there's a penance service with individual confession. And he goes to confession. But this is not just his routine confession, because he's seen things in the silence and the talk and the prayers, maybe some ways of using the internet that are not really good for him, maybe some practices at business that are, at least skirt with the unethical, that aren't really right, certain kinds of conversation that he gets into that aren't really good for him spiritually, and is received warmly by the confessor and comes out of the confession with a sense of peace he's long wanted to feel. And something in him says, I don't want this to pass. I want this to continue. And he resolves to start going to confession regularly after the retreat, and does it. He changes his practice of the internet, quietly pulls away from those conversations, and no longer employs those practices that are not really good. And at the same time, something else starts happening. His wife notices that he's warmer, and their marriage is getting stronger. The children sense him close to them and more interested in them than before. And he finds himself thinking, if just Sunday Mass is helping like this, well, now that I'm taking it more seriously, maybe it's time to start praying a bit each day. And there's a men's prayer breakfast on Tuesday mornings, the first Tuesday of every month. He joins it, enjoys the men, the talks speak to him, notices that some of the men even go to daily Mass, starts doing that occasionally. And one Sunday, the priest invites the parishioners in his homily maybe to spend 10 minutes every morning with Scripture, starts that, likes it, finds himself now exploring where the Lord is calling him more deeply into his vocation. Okay, now we have Ignatius' second rule. This is a beautiful profile of the person who has changed that earlier direction and is now seeking to grow in freedom from sin and to grow in the love and service of God. Now, how's the enemy going to act, and how's the good spirit going to act in this situation? And every one of us will recognize this in our lives. Most likely, if anyone is listening to this conversation, it's because he is in this second spiritual situation with all of our flaws and weaknesses, and the just man falls 7 times a day. Scripture says all of that, but sincerely wants to live this. Excuse me. Now Ignatius says it's the enemy who's going to try to bite and sting and discourage and show the person that it's too difficult. So he has a difficult day at work. It's discouraging. Maybe there's a difficult conversation with one of his children at supper that doesn't resolve really well. And now it's 10 o'clock. He's in his study. Normally at this time, he does pray with Scripture for 10 minutes, makes an examination of conscience. He has a simple routine of prayer with which he ends the day. But now, as he sits at his desk, a few inches in front of one hand is the Bible. Nothing in him wants to reach out for it. Doesn't feel God's closeness. No energy for prayer. A few inches in front of the other hand is the phone. Everything in him wants to reach out for it in a way that he knows can become, to use Ignatius' phrase, low and earthly. And one touch can become 100, become 200.
Yeah.
All right. This voice that says to him now, look at you. You thought you were growing spiritually? What a mess you are. Look at you, don't even want to pray. You're not really much of a man of prayer, and look at you, so willing to give into a temptation that you know where it leads, and you're ready to do it. Who are you to think that you're ever really going to change from the person you were before? How many times have you tried? How long has it ever lasted? So very reverently now, have any of us ever, listening now, when we've wanted to let go of something that's not good for us spiritually, or embrace something that will help us grow spiritually, have we ever heard those kinds of discouraging voices? It's too difficult. You know yourself, you can't do it. No shame. I can't say that with enough energy in experiencing it. This is simply a tactic of the enemy. Ignatius describes it in his second rule. And this is the point. Be aware of this. So when the man sits there at 10 o'clock, what if he's not aware of the enemy's tactic here, doesn't understand it for the tactic of the enemy that it is, and doesn't take action to reject it, and does go on the phone at 10, puts it down at 11:30? What's in his heart as he retires? What's in his heart as he begins the next day? I mean, you can see this matters. This is where the stuff of the spiritual life is lived, and this is where Ignatius really wants to be our friend and help us. But what if, by God's grace and with a bit of courage, he is able to say, wait a minute. I love that wait a minute in the spiritual life, because that's the be aware. This isn't right. This is not good. Okay, that's the understand. However articulately he says it, he knows that this is not right. This is not good. This is not of God. and he rejects it and with some courage reaches out for the Bible and never picks
Mm.
up the phone that evening. Now what's in his heart as he retires? What's in his heart as he wakens the next day and relates to his wife and goes off to work? So this is what these rules can do. They can help us in these many daily situations that we face that are the real stuff of 98% of the spiritual life, because that's where the peak moments only happen a few times. Most of it is right here. So that's just a brief description of Ignatius' first two rules.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. I feel like you were telling my own story there when you were just that whole thing about college and
You
drugs
know,
and all that stuff.
John, I'll just add this if you'll allow me. One time,
Sure,
I went through this with a group of men in a retreat, and some days of retreat. And when it was over, we were having a final conversation, and I used that example of 10 o'clock. Quite a lot, the
sure.
Bible and the smartphone, because we all recognize it. Um, and one of them said, every time you said that, I wanted to say, get up and say, would you stop talking about me? you know,
That's right.
it's
That's
yeah,
right.
it's all of us with our
Yeah,
different
you're
nuances, but it's all of us.
right. They were
And
convicted
see, here's
by
the
it.
thing, John. There is no shame in experiencing these tactics of the enemy. It's simply what happens in living the spiritual life in a, yes, fallen, but above all, loved and redeemed world. So to get familiar with these tactics of the enemy, to be aware of them, to understand them for what they are, and to have the tools, which is what Ignatius gives you in the last 10 of the 14 rules to reject them, is enormously uplifting and encouraging in the spiritual life.
Hmm. And I think it's just the example you gave and what you've been talking about here. It's so helpful to men to hear things like this. And so I'm not the only one, right? Because the devil likes to try to
No.
separate us, to isolate us, to think we're the only one with a drinking problem or a pornography problem or someone who doesn't speak to their wife the way they should. And so we get in that place where we can get pretty down on ourselves and think, why even try? Which I think is the goal of all of his efforts, right? Is why even try? Just stop, quit trying to
Sure.
be something different and give this up. And, those could take you to a place of a desolate place. And I know that's something that I wanted you to speak about here too is, the idea which come later in the steps too of consolation and desolation. What those things feel like, what we experience during the two things, and what we need to be doing in those times. If you could talk a little bit about that in relation to the rules and furthering a little bit in the next few steps.
Sure. Yeah. So the key thing here is to understand what Ignatius means by these two phrases, spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation. Actually, without those titles, we've used them in the example that I gave just a bit earlier.
Yeah.
So when the man, for example, goes to confession and he comes out of the confession feeling a warm sense of peace and goodness in his heart and a sense of being close to God and God's love with him, he is experiencing what Ignatius calls spiritual consolation. Consolation is a heart level word. If you think of head, meaning thoughts and ideas and logic, and heart, feelings, emotions, and so forth, consolation is a heart level word, and it just means an uplifting movement of the heart. So joy, hope, gratitude, love, peace, and so forth. And spiritual consolation because it's on the level of our relationship with God. There's also just a natural, call it non-spiritual, just human or emotional consolation. You listen to some nice music and you just feel a little better. You're chipper or
Yeah.
something, or you
Yeah.
have a good conversation with someone and you enjoy it. Those are all good things, obviously. But what Ignatius is speaking about is these uplifting movements of the heart on the level of faith in our relationship with God, like the man feels after his confession. And then its counterpart is spiritual desolation, which is exactly the opposite. And, John, to my mind, I think spiritual desolation for most of us, most dedicated people, and that's going to be your listeners, um, for most of the way on the spiritual life, this is the real problem. And to be aware of it, understand it, and know how to take action to reject it, I think for most of us on a daily level is the greatest gift God gave to the church through Ignatius of Loyola. So if spiritual consolation is an uplifting movement of the heart, desolation is going to be a heavy movement of the heart, a downward, a heavy movement of the heart. So sorrow, anxiety, discouragement, sadness, and so forth. And Ignatius is speaking about these on the spiritual level. So let's go back to our man at 10 o'clock after the discouraging day. So let's say he had a difficult interchange with his boss at work, and something in a project isn't turning out as well as he hoped. And that's kind of discouraging. And then he has the conversation with, let's say, his son that doesn't go as well as he'd hoped. Right there is a desolation there. There's a heaviness of heart, but it's on the natural level. So call it non-spiritual, excuse me, non non-spiritual or just natural um, desolation. But now at 10 o'clock, there he is at his desk. Normally, he really likes to spend these minutes in prayer with the Lord. But tonight, he doesn't even feel God's closeness at all. He has no energy for prayer. He just feels discouraged about what's happening in his spiritual life. He just feels like, oh, let me just slide into something that's more gratifying, and there's the phone and so forth. With reverence, I say with reverence because we all experience this, and there's no shame in this. He is experiencing spiritual desolation, which is a tactic of the enemy, precisely as you say, John, to try to discourage us from going forward in the spiritual life. No shame in experiencing it.
Yeah.
But what makes all the difference is to be aware. Wait a minute. To understand it. You know what? This is not God. This is not good. There's a tempter going on here. And then to take action to reject it. I am going to pick up the Bible the way I always do every night at 10 o'clock. That's Ignatius's rule 5. When he tells us, when you're in spiritual desolation, don't change anything you'd ever planned to do in your spiritual life before the desolation began. You plan to go to confession at 4 o'clock the upcoming Saturday. It's on your calendar. The difficult day at work on Friday, difficult conversation at supper, discouragement Saturday morning. I don't know. Maybe I'm not in any shape to go to confession today. We'll do it next week. Okay. There's your rule 5. You know, you're in a time of desolation. You're thinking of making a change. Never do it. So let me just say the 8 words that are classic. When I teach this, I have people repeat these twice with me. I say them and repeat them twice. In time of desolation, never make a change. I will say it once more. In
Yeah.
time of desolation, never make a change. That single rule, in time of desolation, never make a change. I slipped a third one in there
That's okay.
um, consciously. But
Yeah.
those 8 words, if you put them in practice, those will get you safely through almost any darkness you may experience in the spiritual life. Like the man at 10 o'clock remembers rule 5. No, Lord, my practice is at 10 o'clock, I pick up the Bible for 10 minutes. And I recognize I'm in a time of desolation. I'm not going to change that. I'm going to be firm and constant, Ignatius says, in what I'd planned before. That'll get you through so much and save you so much sorrow in the spiritual life. I love Rule 5.
Yeah. You
Recently,
too.
when I taught it, one of the participants was a young man, um, made kind of like a golf-style shirt out of it, and on it was written, "Stay alive with Rule 5." I'd like to
That's
see those
awesome.
marketed.
Right, I hear you. Well, and it's so right. Before in my life, before I was introduced to this and read it and listened to you multiple times, I would have been the guy that changed something. That I would have been the guy that fell and just said, why even try? Why do it? Nothing's going right in my life, and this isn't going to help either. And you can almost see if you take yourself out of the situation and look at yourself as if you were out of your body. It sounds weird, but you can almost envision the evil one just whispering in your ear, like, almost working you like a puppet to say those things because that's what he wants of you, right? He wants you to quit and to lay those things down. And that was one of the most helpful things that I ever learned in my Catholic faith was stick to the plan, stick to the plan. Don't change anything. Do the things you need to do because that at the middle of it all, that's what the devil is trying to get you not to do. He's trying to get you to break your habits, to walk away from God, and he wins. He wins. He wins when he takes someone away from God. So that was one of the most helpful things for me too. So let me ask you this: when we're in desolation, which can be a short period of time, it can be a medium or a long period of time. I know desolation. There's no limits on when we're in it and when we're not. How does one start to come out of that desolation? What can we do on our own to help the process of moving from those desolate times?
Well, John, I can see you know the rules because you're just thinking right with Ignatius. Because from In Rule 5, basically, he says, don't let the enemy into your territory. Stay firm
Mm,
with what you'd planned. From Rule 6 on, what he's doing is giving us tools to go right at the enemy's tactic.
mm,
So, Rule 5, don't change what you'd planned to do spiritually, what you'd planned before the desolation began. When you're in desolation, never change it. Stay firm and carry it through. In Rule 6, which is the counterpart to Rule 5, Ignatius tells us of the changes that we should make in desolation, never to what we plan to do, but to ourselves and to the way we're facing the desolation. So we kind of gear up. Um, a football player once said to me, I think of Rule 5 as defense. You don't let the enemy into your territory. And Rule 6 is offense. You go right at the enemy. So
mm.
Ignatius gives 4 tools there. And John, we're not going to have time to go into this in enough detail.
Sure.
Um, if I may, I'd like to of course, I wrote the book on this that you mentioned. I think you mentioned the discernment of spirits, Ignatian wisdom for our lives
Hmm.
today. Ignatian wisdom. I've written enough books now. I can't remember the subtitle of it. Um,
It's a good
eh,
problem to have.
uh, the main title is The Discernment of Spirits, the purple
Sure.
colored book, which will
Yes.
take a person through all of these rules. And I'd also like to
Yes, sir.
mention the
Yeah.
podcast. Oh, there it is. Yeah. What is the
Yeah.
subtitle?
An Ignatian guide for everyday living. I don't know if
Ignatian
I've got
Guide
it.
for Everyday
Yeah.
Living.
There you go.
And then together with that, I'd like to mention the series of podcasts that I did with
Mm,
Discerning Hearts. That is an easy way and an accessible way. We can all listen to podcasts at various driving or
sure.
working or exercising, whatever. Um, and you can find those on the discerninghearts.com website, but maybe even more accessibly on the Discerning Hearts app, which is a free app
Okay.
and loaded with wonderful stuff. If you do download the Discerning Hearts app, tap on spiritual formation. My name will come up, tap on that, and then you'll see the series entitled Discernment of Spirits. And that'll take you through all 14 rules in a way we can't, do in the shorter time
Sure.
that we have here. But the 4 tools that Ignatius mentions in Rule 6 are prayer of petition. As the man sits there at 10 o'clock, let him lift up his heart. Is it too simple to say, Jesus, help me? Mary, be with me. I could go down a wrong path here, and I'm weak, and I could do it. Be with me. Father, I need your love right now. Secondly, what he calls meditation. Have Bible verses right at hand that'll help you. Think
Mm,
back to times you've been in the struggle before and God got you safely through. One woman had what she called her anti-desolation song, which she would sing. It was a song of trust in God's grace.
yeah.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Though I walk in a dark valley, I fear no evil. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom should I fear? So, consciously calling these things to mind and pondering them right in the desolation and the struggle. And then what Ignatius calls much examination. So, what if the man at 10 o'clock, when what he's feeling is this day was awful,
Yeah.
everything's heavy. I don't feel God's closeness. It's discouraging. Tomorrow's probably going to be just as bad or worse. All of this cloud of heaviness is there. And then he stops and looks at it and realizes, you know what? This morning, when I got up and spent some time in prayer, I was actually pretty happy. And it was none of this started until mid morning when I got that report on the project that I'm working on that was discouraging for me. And I sort of gave into it and just let things go and just sort of flop through the day and so on. Okay, you can't do much about an overwhelming cloud of discouragement and heaviness and desolation, but you can do something about a project that didn't turn out as well as you'd hoped. All right, you know what? I'm going to talk to my coworker tomorrow. I'm going to talk with the boss. We're going to figure out what went wrong here, and we're going to get this thing going. And already he's going to start to feel a lot better about this. That's something you can do something about. And finally, what Ignatius calls suitable penance. Instead of fleeing into gratification, which is probably only going to make it worse, whether it's the phone or the refrigerator for the fourth time, or flopping in front of the TV, or just
Yeah.
social media in a way that's not good, Netflix, YouTube, whatever it is, stand your ground. If the best thing you can do is wait 10 minutes before you pick up the phone, wait those 10 minutes. That may be pretty hard to do in desolation, but God can do a lot in 10 minutes. As Therese tells her sister, you take one small step with the Spirit, and the Spirit will show you the next and the next and the next. Okay, so that's Rule 6, these 4 tools that Ignatius applies. If you apply Rules 5 and 6 together, the changes you shouldn't make and those you should make, you're going to be well ahead of the game in dealing with desolation.
Sure. I want to talk about another thing really quickly too, consolation. So obviously, whenever we're feeling wonderful, and it sounds like there's a track of your favorite music playing in your head, the birds are singing, everything's going your way. There is a almost a proclivity to stop praying, to stop awareness that there are going to be continued times of desolation that come your way. And I know Ignatius talks about that a little bit, about how when we're in consolation, there can be traps or pitfalls of not praying, of thinking everything's fine, it's always going to be fine, and to let your guard down. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because oftentimes when everything's going our way, we sort of lax on our spiritual practices and things
Mm.
sometimes because we feel like everything's fine, and we let our guard down. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Now, I do want to say that the main thing, the primary thing always, when God gives the grace, because that's what it is, it's a grace,
Mm-hmm.
a freely given gift of God. When God gives us the grace of spiritual consolation, like the warmth and the joy and the peace that the man feels after the confession
Mm-hmm.
during the retreat, our primary call is, to use Ignatius' word, is to accept it, to receive it, to drink it in, to allow the Lord to love us, to strengthen us, to prepare us for struggle, to give us joy and energy in the spiritual life through it. There's a lovely experience in the life of St. Elizabeth Seton. It happens when she's 15, and she describes it in a letter to a friend many years later when this young woman whose mother has died, whose father is more absent than she would need, and starved for a father's love, on a summer's day goes out in the woods and she sits under a chestnut tree, and God floods her heart with love and warmth and closeness. And God was my father, my all. I laughed, cried, thinking of how far he could put me above all sorrow. Then she says, then I laid still to enjoy the heavenly peace that came over my soul, spiritual consolation. And I am sure in the 2 hours so enjoyed grew 10 years in the spiritual life. I don't think we'll ever get a better description of the primary call in time of spiritual consolation. Just receive God's love. There's a reason why he's giving it, and so much growth in our spiritual lives will come through spiritual consolation. Now, having said that, which is the primary thing, all that you've said, John, yeah, all of that is important. So we don't want to think in time of spiritual consolation. For the last 3 weeks, prayer has been easy, and I've been getting to Mass more often during the week, and the Bible is alive for me when I read it. And I love what's happening in my marriage, and as I relate to my children, as I try to live like Christ more fully. We don't want to think that desolation will never come back. It will
Yeah,
at some
sure.
point. There's no shame in that. There's no surprise in that. That's just, as I said, living the spiritual life in a fallen, redeemed, and loved world. So in Rule 10, Ignatius says, when you're in a time of consolation, be aware that desolation will, and just uninhibitedly drinking in the gift and the love and the joy of it. But in those days or weeks of consolation, think ahead to the fact that desolation will return and prepare for it. Take in strength that will make a big difference when that comes. And then Ignatius also in Rule 11 invites us in time of spiritual consolation to remain humble. And that's what you
Yeah.
were really getting at there, John, because um, and he says the way to remain humble in times of consolation is just to remember how we struggle when we don't have that
Yeah.
consolation and
Yes, sir.
we're in desolation. Because what that does is it saves us from presuming on our strength in a way that can set us up, um, for a kind of a fall that be difficult in the spiritual life. So we remain grateful, receive the love, and we remain humble in consolation. Humble in consolation, trusting in desolation. That's how we go on solidly in the spiritual life.
Yeah, and I tell you, go ahead. You sound like you were going to say something else. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're actually doing a marvelous job, John. We've got through an awful lot of the rules here.
Sure,
I
sure.
just I want to be sure that we mention another of them in conjunction, well, on its own, but also in conjunction with Rule
Sure.
5. A few minutes ago, I said that I begged of us never to forget Rule 5 because Rule 5 would get us safely through almost any spiritual darkness we may encounter in life. In the darkness of desolation, don't make changes to anything in your spiritual life. Now I'll complete that. If you can never forget rules 5 and 13 together, those two rules will get you safely through any darkness you may ever encounter in the spiritual life. Rule 5, don't make changes in the darkness of the desolation. Rule 13, don't be alone in the darkness and the heaviness and the burden
Yeah.
and the temptation, but find the appropriate, wise, and competent spiritual person and speak with that person. If you do those two things, rules 5 and 13, that'll get you safely through any darkness you may ever encounter. And that's only two of the 14 rules.
Sure. Well, and you got to one of my last points here, one of the last questions I want to ask you about. Obviously, you've done a lot of spiritual direction. You've given your life to teaching people discernment and all of those things. I think for the everyday guy, and looking back at my own life, I never once, for the first few years I was Catholic, ever heard of a spiritual director. Why I would need one? Why would I would ever go to anybody outside of confession? What is the need for that spiritual direction? I mean, you just sort of mentioned it in finding that person in desolation, and and I have to tell you that has been such consolation for me, for lack of a better word, to have my spiritual director to go to when I'm struggling with things, whether it's a financial issue, a decision that affects the family, a certain sin or something that I'm struggling with and can't seem to get out of. Just knowing I've got someone there has been such a gift. So, to your everyday average guy out here that may have never even thought about a spiritual director or even heard about it at this point, what would you say about that and the necessity of having one?
Sure. Yeah. Let's first of all, let's just look at it on a natural level. You know, when you have a burden in your heart, and then you have a friend or a spouse or someone with whom you're able to speak really openly about it. And maybe the person doesn't even say anything, the other person just listens and understands what you're going through. You rise from that conversation with your heart much lightened and with new energy and even new clarity, simply having putting things into word to deal with the situation. All right, let's transfer that dynamic now to the spiritual life. You know, it's the basic reason why Jesus founded a church. We're not meant to walk the spiritual life alone, but we're meant to assist each other, to be companions for each other on this journey. And this is just one really rich application of that overall truth about our life of faith. So the sacrament of confession is there to for the forgiveness of sins. When we have failed, sins, our faults and failings, we bring them to the Lord. We receive the outpouring of His love, His mercy, His healing, and His forgiveness. And that infusion of grace strengthens us on the spiritual journey. What spiritual direction deals with, sometimes you'll get a little mixture of spiritual direction in confession. So a little more is happening than just the forgiveness. We share what our sins are and receive forgiveness, but you may get some spiritual counsel. At that point, you're getting just a little bit of spiritual direction in confession. And if you know a confessor who's willing to do that and whom you find helpful, that's a wonderful, wonderful way to be accompanied in the spiritual life. But what spiritual direction deals with is our relationship with God. Things are like any relationship. It's never static. Things are happening as we pray, as we try to live the gospel, as we interact with others and try to be Christ in the world, as we live the life of the church. There are joys and sorrows, thoughts of one thing and another, times of energy, times of struggle. So much is going on. We're praying. Am I praying in the best way? Would there be some advice from our Catholic spiritual tradition that could help me to grow in the life of prayer? This is what used to happen when I pray, but now this is happening and I don't quite know what's going on. I felt a lot of energy spiritually before, and now it seems less, and I don't really know how to make sense out of that and where the Lord is leading and so forth. So it's this, all of this, which has to do with the lived experience of our relationship with God. That's what we bring to spiritual direction. And a spiritual director will listen to our experience as we share it, help us to probably even to be able to express it more clearly than we might on our own, and then probably give us some indications of where the Lord may be leading through all of this, things to avoid, pitfalls, the discouraging lies of the enemy, but above all, where God's love is leading in our lives. So it's that basic principle that it's not good to be alone in the spiritual life. You know, when God says that from the beginning of time, excuse me, that it is not good for the man to be
To be
alone. That's
alone.
true in terms of marriage, but it's true on every dimension of our existence, and that includes the spiritual life. So, men's groups, husbands and wives, where that's possible, that's a beautiful way to be a company. Not trying to be each other's spiritual director, but just each other's companion and friend and spouse in the Lord. Spiritual friends, with just guys with whom you can talk about these kinds of things. And today, with digital resources, all sorts of ways of doing that are available to us. And then, where it's possible, a formal spiritual director, like you mentioned, John, where you meet periodically and you have a chance to talk out your spiritual experience and be helped with it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you've really left us with a lot of information today, and I mean, I could have hoped for a better time on this. I think a lot of people are going to be helped by this. Father Gallagher, for people that have had their interest piqued, that want to know more about this or more about specifically the way that you've taught this and described it, where can they go to start? If I wanted to just dive into this, where would you direct them to start? And please tell them where they can find out more about you and what you're doing.
Well, everything that I'll mention, with the exceptions of the podcast, everything else, all the books and DVDs and everything else, is all available through my website, which is just timothygallagher.org. So fathertimothygallagher.org. If you just do a web search for my name, it'll come right up. And then all of these materials are listed and available through the website. So if a person wants to read about this, there is the book that you held up, John, the purple book, The
Mm-hmm.
Discernment of Spirits, an Ignatian Guide for Everyday Living. And if you'd like to explore it with a specific application to marriage, there is the book that John also mentioned, Discernment of Spirits in Marriage. There it is,
Yep.
Ignatian Wisdom for Husbands and Wives. Both books will introduce you, I think, pretty well to the rules. And then you'll be on to other resources are listed. If you want to do it in audio form, then I would think the podcasts are probably the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a series of 16 half-hour podcasts, which you can find on the Discerning Hearts app. Um, if you want to do it in visual form, I taught this as a series on EWTN, and there is a DVD entitled Living the Discerning Life, which you can find through EWTN or through my website. Um, and I think those would be the basic resources to get started. I really hope that any one of us for whom this is new material, or maybe have a little introduction to it, I hope you'll want to go further. I will promise you this: if you spend time reading, listening, viewing, joining a group, whatever, getting to know these 14 rules better, a time will come when you will look back with gratitude on any time you spent in doing this. Because, and I say this out of the experience of 40 years now of sharing these with people, you will experience the difference, the hope, the new energy, and the freedom from discouragement that these rules will bring.
Yeah. And the phrase that always sticks out in my mind is what is of God and what isn't. To sum up all of this is that such a help in our life. And so, Father Gallagher, you're such a gift to the church. You have been, as you said, for 40 years. So thank you for everything you've done here. Thank you for joining us. If you are listening to this and you are a member of the Just a Guy in the Pew community, you know that we do these extra interviews with our guests. And Father Gallagher and I have talked about taking a few minutes here in a few minutes to do another small interview on discerning the discernment of spirits in marriage. So if you're somebody in the membership, you could jump in there and you'll be able to see that as well. If you're not, you can become a member at justaguyonthepew.com, and all of that goes to support the ministry, the nonprofit, and what we're doing here. So, Father Tim Gallagher, thank you again so much for your time and just for all the gifts that you've given to us in the church.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
All right. Take care.